The receiving line had not yet thinned when it happened. Marian Ashby had counted 314 candles before the presentation began, which was the kind of thing a woman did when she was trying very hard not to notice how plain her gown was against the assembled splendor of Hartwell Park. She had counted from the doorway, and then she had counted again from the far wall, and the number was the same, which told her the chandeliers were real, and the company was serious, and that she in her altered black silk and her dead father's brooch did not belong among them. This was not a new feeling. It had become, in the 3 months since his death, simply the weather. Lady Fanny Crail, her cousin, had pressed her into attending. "You will wither in that house," Fanny had said, with the cheerful certainty of a woman who had never had occasion to wither. "The Earl gives the finest winter assembly in the county. You will come. It will do you good." Marian had come, because there was nothing left to wither for in the house that was no longer hers, and because her cousin meant well, and because she had not yet learned how to refuse kindness even when she suspected it would cost her something. The cost arrived during the receiving line. She had taken her cue, she understood afterward, from the wrong moment. The gentleman directly ahead of her, a tall figure in dark evening dress who had paused to speak to his steward, had shifted aside just as the receiving hostess, Lady Eldridge, appeared at the head of the room. Marian had assumed him to be the Earl's steward, and the woman behind him to be the hostess. She had performed a full court curtsy. Deep, formal, the kind of curtsy one owed to the crown itself, dropping low enough that the hem of her black skirt pooled against the parquet, her head bowed below the line of her shoulders, one hand pressed in the small of her own back. She held it a beat too long, because she had heard the silence and mistaken it for ceremony. Then someone laughed. Not broadly, not cruelly, at first. The initial sound was a half-smothered thing from somewhere near the fireplace, the noise a person makes when they are startled and have not yet decided whether delight is permissible. The next sound was fully formed, and the one after that was no longer bothering to be quiet. Marian rose from the curtsy. The woman she had honored with it was not Lady Eldridge. She was a parlor maid carrying a tray of cards, who was now standing with enormous stillness and a face stripped of all expression, which was the face of a person who understood that whatever had happened was not her fault, but who was not certain the room would agree. The room did not agree with anything at the moment. The room was too busy being entertained. Marian stood in the center of an 11-foot radius of empty floor, and the laughter moved around her like water around a stone, and she did not look up, because looking up would require her to meet the eyes that went with the laughter. And she was not ready for that. She was 24 years old, and had been schooled by a decent man in the value of composure. And composure was a thing she was choosing, actively, in that moment, with her hands very still at her sides, and her chin at a reasonable angle, and 314 candles burning her from above. "A nobody," said a voice near her left shoulder, quiet and satisfied, the kind of voice that had never once in its life needed to raise itself to be heard. And she cannot even manage a proper greeting. She did not look toward the voice. She had her composure. She would hold it. It was only when the second set of footsteps crossed the floor toward her, deliberate and unhurried, that she raised her eyes at all. Arthur Vane, Earl of Ashford, was 34 years old, and the room knew it, because the room always knew everything about him, and he was used to this the way a man grows used to cold weather. Not indifferent to it, but no longer startled by it. He was tall with dark hair, and a stillness about him that had been there so long it had become a feature rather than a posture, and he was walking toward her as though the laughter were weather he had not noticed, as though the distance between the door and the center of the room were nothing at all. He stopped 2 feet from Marian Ashby. He looked at the brooch. It was a small thing, barely an inch across, an oval of plain silver, a crest engraved in a style that was 30 years old and not fashionable, worn on the left breast of her morning gown where another woman might have worn pearls or a cameo. He knew it the moment he saw it because he had grown up seeing it in his father's study, on the watch fob of the only man his father had ever called, in the precise word his father used, honest. He looked from the brooch to her face, and something in his expression changed, very slightly, and was immediately replaced with the stillness again. He said to the room rather than to her in a voice that carried the particular flatness of a man who did not need to raise it, "Miss Ashby, you are welcome to Hartwell Park." The laughter stopped. It did not fade. It stopped as a struck glass goes silent when a second hand covers it. The room recalibrated. People recalibrate quickly in these circumstances, which is either the great virtue or the great shame of society, and Marian could not, at that moment, decide which. There was a shuffling of positioning near the fireplace, a brief adjustment among the women who had been the primary source of the initial sound, the kind of social reconfiguration that happens when a room determines it has misjudged the terrain. Lady Eldridge, the hostess, moved through the crowd with the practiced ease of a woman who had managed public awkwardness since before most of her guests were born, and she touched Marian briefly on the arm as she passed, a small legible gesture that meant nothing, and everything depending on who was watching. Several people watched. She curtsied again, this time at the correct depth and to the correct person, and said, "Thank you, my lord," and felt the blood leaving her face by increments. She said it steadily, which was the most she could ask of herself. He inclined his head and returned to his place near the terrace doors, and the room resumed its business, and Marian went to find a chair near the wall, where she could breathe at a pace of her own choosing, and attempt to understand what had just happened. She did not understand it for some time. What she understood, with some clarity, was the quality of the attention that followed her to the chair. Not the warm and forgiving kind, not the hostile kind, the recalibrating kind, which is the most exhausting of the three, because it requires a woman to hold still while a room decides what it thinks of her, and holding still while rooms decided things was an occupation she had never found comfortable. The brooch had been her father's last possession of any significance. Henry Ashby had spent 31 years as solicitor to the Vane family, serving the old Earl through 3 decades of estate management, disputed inheritances, and the slow geological work of keeping a great house in order through time and debt and death and change. He had been methodical and thorough and had never, not once, taken a farthing beyond his fee. This was not a virtue he spoke about. It was simply how he was made, the same way a well-built table does not speak about its joints, but simply holds. He had raised his daughter on the same principle without naming it as a principle. There was the work, and you did it. And what you took from the work was the work itself, and the clean conscience that attended it. And if no one witnessed that, if no one confirmed it, well, a man who required confirmation for his own honesty was not honest, he was performing honesty for an audience. Marian had understood this, growing up. She had understood it intellectually. She had spent the last 3 months understanding it in the more painful sense, which was the sense in which you understood a thing through its absence. A clean conscience was a warm and private thing. It was not, in itself, an income. It was not a house. It was not a future in a world that required women to be attached to something or someone with standing. And Henry Ashby, for all his precision, had not accumulated anything so vulgar as savings sufficient to carry his daughter past his own death. She had the furnishings from the Derbyshire house, now leased to a manufacturer of some kind. She did not inquire, and the small quarterly sum her cousin Fanny pressed on her with the cheerful insistence of someone who did not know how to be tactful about charity. And she had the brooch. When the old Earl died the previous autumn, a sealed instruction had been left with the family's London solicitor, alongside the will. It named only one bequest outside the family. The oval silver brooch that had sat on the Earl's desk for 40 years, not on his person, but on his desk, as a weight for correspondence, was to be sent to Henry Ashby's daughter. The accompanying letter, in the old Earl's hand, said only that your father kept faith with this family when faith cost him something. Let her know we understood what that was worth. The brooch had arrived at the house in Derbyshire 1 week before Henry Ashby died. He had pressed it into his daughter's hand and told her it was a decoration and she should wear it. She had been too tired with grief, at the time, to tell him she understood it was something else. It was his 31 years, compressed into a small oval of silver, It was the only confirmation he had ever received, and he was giving it to her, because she was the only one left to give it to. She had held it while he slept, and thought about how strange it was that a life as disciplined and decent as his could be distilled at its end into an inch of engraved metal, and how that was not a sadness, but a kind of accuracy. Some men required monuments. Henry Ashby required an oval. She had worn it today because it was the only ornament she owned that did not feel like a claim. It had not occurred to her that it would read, in this room, as anything. The tea that followed the presentation was held in the long salon, and it was during the tea that Mrs. Georgiana Drummond, who was the mother of Lady Cecily Drummond, and the dominant power in that particular corner of the county's social geography, located Marian among the chairs and delivered the second pronouncement.
"Miss Ashby, I believe,"
she said to a small cluster of women who had not, as far as Marian could tell, asked the solicitor's daughter. "Nobody at all." She paused to set down her teacup. "It is kind of Lady Fanny to bring her out. Of course, she looks harmless enough." Marian heard this from 6 feet away, which was close enough to be intended, and far enough to require that she not respond. She looked at her tea, which was cooling. Lady Cecily Drummond, who had been standing beside her mother, glanced once at Marian and then glanced away, which was not cruelty so much as the automatic prioritization of the socially endorsed. She was very beautiful, Lady Cecily, with the blonde composure of a woman who had been told she was the correct choice from an early age, and had absorbed the information without surprise. Marian drank her tea. The grounds at Hartwell Park were kept with the particular precision of an estate that had not been neglected at any point in living memory. The hedges clipped, the gravel raked, the rose arbors cut back for winter, but still structured, still visible in their proportions even stripped of leaf. Marian walked them the following morning before the rest of the house had fully woken. Because sleep had not been cooperative, and the alternative was lying in the ceiling-stared dark of the borrowed room, rehearsing the sound of 300 people going quiet. She was at the far end of the kitchen garden, examining a trough of forced narcissus that had no business being alive in December, when she heard the footsteps on the gravel behind her. "Come inside," Lord Ashford said from somewhere behind her left shoulder. "The morning is too cold for what you are wearing." She turned. He was in a heavy coat, and had come from the direction of the stables, and the cold had put color into his face that had not been there the evening before, and he was looking at her with the expression she was beginning to recognize as his version of attention, which was to say, there was nothing casual about it. "I am perfectly comfortable," she said. "No," he said. "You are cold, and you have decided not to say so." He looked at the narcissus. "They were my mother's. She had them started every October." She did not know what to do with that, so she said nothing. He said after a moment, "The brooch was my father's instruction. I should have said so last night clearly." So the room understood the context. "I did not manage it well." "You managed it well enough, my lord." "The laughter was not well. I do not offer comfort by saying I stopped it. I should have prevented it." She looked at him. There was something in the way he said it that was not apologizing. Not quite. But it was not the polished management of a social inconvenience either. It was the plain statement of a man who held himself to a standard and had found himself short of it by a small margin and was naming that shortfall without drama. She said, because it was honest. It was a strange curtsy. He said it was a thorough curtsy. She felt, very briefly, something that might have been the beginning of a smile, and suppressed it because the morning was cold and she had not yet earned it. They walked back to the house at a proper distance without speaking, and he held the garden door, and she passed through it, and her shoulder passed within 3 inches of his coat, and her body registered this with the specificity of a compass needle registering north, which told her nothing useful and which she immediately directed elsewhere. She was aware of exactly where he was in the corridor behind her. She was aware of the sound his boots made on the stone and how it differed from her own footsteps, and she was aware that she was being aware of this, which was precisely the kind of circular awareness that led to nothing good. He said, "At the threshold, "Miss Ashby." She stopped. He said, "Did you know the crest before you wore it?" She turned to look at him. The corridor light was low at this hour, and he was still in his coat, and his face in the winter morning had the quality of a man who spent a great deal of time alone and had arranged his expression accordingly. So it did not give away more than was useful. "I knew it was an Ashford crest," she said. "I did not know what it would signify here." He nodded, once the kind of nod that was completing a calculation, not dismissing a conversation. He appeared to be deciding something. He said, "Sit down at breakfast if you would. You look as though you have not eaten since the curtsy." It was said levelly, and yet there was something in the precision of it that was almost gentle. It was the kind of sentence that understood she had been cold in the garden and hungry since the night before, and would not say so to anyone. And it addressed both of these things without requiring her to acknowledge them, which was either very perceptive or very managing. And she had not yet decided which. She went to breakfast. She did not examine the feeling that followed her there. She ate a proper amount of bread, and drank 2 cups of tea, and spoke to Lady Fanny about the roads, and she was careful, and she had been careful her entire life, and she was not going to stop being careful, because a man had brought her in from a cold garden and looked at her as though he were reading a document he had not expected to find interesting. It was 2 days later that she understood. Something had changed in him as well, though he did not know she knew. She had been reading to Clara. The child had come to her sideways, in the way of very young children who want something they have not been given permission to want, appearing at the door of the morning room where Marian sat reading, standing in the doorway for a long moment, before entering on small determined feet and climbing onto the sofa beside her. She was 3 years old, with dark hair and the watchful expression of someone who had learned to assess adults for their reliability before trusting them with much. Marian had shown her the pictures in the natural history volume she was reading. Then she had begun to read aloud, slowly, choosing the descriptions of birds and flowers and ignoring the more clinical passages. The child had listened. Then the child had leaned against her, and then the child had fallen asleep, heavy and certain, against Marian's arm. Marian had not moved. She had continued to read aloud, quietly, to the sleeping child, because it seemed to her that a child who had fallen asleep during a story deserved to have the story continue, even if she could no longer hear it. She had kept her voice soft and turned the pages with her free hand, and made no attempt to disentangle herself. And she was on the 4th page about migrating swallows when she became aware that the door, which had been half open, was not moving as it had been a moment before. She did not look up. She kept reading. She did not look toward the doorway. She kept her voice at the same even pace, the same soft register, because the child's sleep was a fragile and particular thing, and she was not going to disturb it with a change in her own breathing. She had seen in the corner of her eye the stillness in the doorway that was particular to one person in this house. She had learned to recognize it, the way one learns to recognize a specific quality of weather, not by any single defining characteristic, but by the aggregate of small things, the particular silence, the absence of the sounds a person makes when they are not paying close attention. He was looking at his daughter. She could not see his face, but she understood this from the direction of the stillness, and she kept her voice level and turned the page, and Clara slept on without adjusting, one small fist curled against Marian's sleeve. She read about the swallows and their 8,000 miles, and the way they returned each spring to the same eaves without maps, guided by something so internal it had no name in the natural philosophy texts, only the bare fact of the returning. He was there for perhaps 3 minutes, though she did not count them with any accuracy. Then the door was entirely open again and the hallway was empty, and Marian finished the page and then read 3 more, before she finally allowed herself to close the book and sit in the warm weight of the sleeping child and feel quietly, and without anyone watching, that she had done the right thing. She thought of her father, who had read to her every evening until she was 12, and who had never made ceremony of it. He had simply read, and she had simply listened, and it had been a daily act of decency so ordinary and complete that she had never thought to name it until it was no longer possible. The following afternoon, he found her walking the long gallery. The portraits were Vane family across 4 generations, the same dark hair appearing and receding through oil paint and differing fashions of coat. She had been studying a woman in a blue gown from the previous century when she heard him on the boards behind her. He stood beside her and looked at the same portrait. He said without preamble, "My father left the brooch to you because he said your father was the only man in 30 years who could have stolen from him and did not." She waited. He said he did not mean the money. He was not, I think, at risk of being robbed. He meant the other kind of taking. The kind where a man who holds your confidence uses it to make himself more comfortable and tells himself it was practical. Marian said carefully, "My father was very precise. He was also capable of far more than he was paid for. And my father knew it, and it made him feel that the relationship was not balanced." He paused. He did not know how to correct that in life, so he left the brooch. She did not look at him. She looked at the woman in the blue gown. He said quietly, "There was a portrait here, in my wife's sitting room. I had it covered. Clara does not know what her mother looked like yet, and I am not certain when to show her, and I do not manage that uncertainty well." The sentence arrived without preparation and settled in the air between them. She said, "What was her name?" "Eleanor." The word was plain and it cost him something, and he did not hide the cost. "She died 2 years ago. The confinement. I had pressed too soon. She had not recovered from the first child, and I had let the question of an heir carry more weight than her health, and she did not argue with me, and I did not notice she wasn't arguing until it was too late to matter." He stopped. She said nothing for a long moment. Then she said, "You were telling me this because you want me to understand that you are not unkind by disposition." He turned to look at her, and the expression was very direct and held something uncertain in it, which was the first uncertain thing she had seen on his face. "Yes," he said. She looked at him for a moment. Then she looked back at the portrait, and the warmth in her chest was a thing she did not name, because naming it would require her to decide what to do about it, and she had not yet earned that decision, and she was careful. He reached across the space between them, and his hand stopped 2 inches from her wrist. Not touching, stopping. The hand was still, and the pause was so precise, it was nearly a statement. He lowered his hand. "Miss Ashby," he said. "Lord Ashford." He said, "I should see to the estate accounts." She said, "Of course." He walked away, and she put her free hand against the cold glass of the gallery window and felt her own pulse in her palm, like something she had dropped and was only now finding. If you have stayed this far, and something tells me you have, then you understand why her heart was doing what it was doing and why she did not fully trust it. Leave a word below if you know that particular silence. The one that lives in the inches between a hand and a wrist, the accounts were delivered the following morning, not the estate accounts. The other ones. Marian learned of it from Lady Fanny, who learned of it from the housekeeper who had seen the steward carry a folder of papers into the library, where Lord Ashford and Mrs. Drummond's solicitor had been sequestered for 40 minutes. The preliminary arrangement regarding Lady Cecily had been confirmed. The formal announcement was expected before the week's end. There was apparently a line on the second page confirming the mutual benefit of the match, and another line detailing the settlement, and a third line naming the date of the formal betrothal dinner. Marian sat with this for a time. She was in her room, which was borrowed and pleasant and did not belong to her, and the fire was good, and the window showed the formal garden going gray with December. The narcissus on the kitchen garden ledge would still be there, she thought, unreasonably alive in the cold. His mother had started them every October. He had told her this without planning to. She was fairly certain. It was the kind of detail that came out sideways. She thought about the word arrangement and the word confirmation, and the space between a hand and a wrist, and she thought about a small girl asleep on a sofa and a man in a corridor who had stood very still and not come in. She thought about how the corridor had been empty when she finally looked, She had been here before. Not in this room. This room was borrowed, but in this particular comprehension. The comprehension that the warmth you thought you had located was not located there after all. That the room did not hold what you had briefly allowed yourself to imagine it held. She had learned it with her father's house, which had been comfortable, and then suddenly someone else's. She had learned it with the Derbyshire income, which had been sufficient, and then suddenly nothing. She was becoming skilled at this particular learning. She found the brooch in its cloth and began to wrap it. She would leave it with the housekeeper in the morning. She could not return it in person without making the gesture a statement, and she did not have the standing for statements. She was still wrapping it when the door of the adjacent sitting room opened, and the voice she had been avoiding inside her own chest said, through the connecting door she had not thought to latch, "Do not leave the room." "I have not finished the conversation." She stood still. He appeared in the doorway. He was in his evening coat, which told her he had come from dressing for dinner, and he looked at the brooch in her hands, and something crossed his face that was not the stillness. She said with great composure, "I was returning it." "It belongs here. It belongs to you with respect, my lord. It was a token from your father to mine, and both of them are gone, and I do not think it was intended to create an obligation for either of their children." He said, "I know what it was intended to create." And then he stopped, because the word create had gotten ahead of his composure, and he was reconstructing his face. She waited. He said, "The Cecily arrangement was made in October, before you arrived. It was practical. It remains practical. I am not a man who finds it easy to unmake practical things." She said with all the honesty she had left, "I have not asked you to unmake anything." He looked at her for a long moment. Then he said, "No, you have not." He looked at the brooch in her cloth. "Put it back on." He said, "Please." She looked at him. He said, "Please." She put it back. He left, and she stood by the window and watched the dark come down over the kitchen garden. And she did not let herself think about the way he had said "please" with the steadiness gone out of him, because thinking about it would not help her in the morning, and the morning was coming and she had no skill at all for hoping. The dinner at which everything changed was held on a Friday. The county had gathered 32 people at a table that could hold 40, which meant there was room for the absence of certain arrangements and for the presence of other things entirely. Marian sat at the lower end near Lady Fanny, in the chair that was appropriate for a woman of her station at a dinner of this kind. She was wearing the brooch. She had decided to wear it because it was her father's honor, and she would not unwear it out of social anxiety. And if that meant she sat in some discomfort for 3 courses, then she sat in discomfort. And that was the end of it. Mrs. Drummond was seated at mid-table near enough to Lord Ashford to make her position clear, with Lady Cecily arranged on the other side, and the placement had the tidiness of a plan that expected no interference. Marian ate the soup. She ate the fish course. She was part way through the remove when she heard Mrs. Drummond's voice pitched to carry to the end of the table where the arrangements were being settled, saying with the bright certainty of a woman who had won every room she had ever entered, "She is nobody, my lord." You cannot mean to attach any significance to the matter. The table did not hear this, not the whole table, but Marian did, and 3 people nearby did. And Lord Ashford, who was 2 chairs from Mrs. Baldon's, Drummond on her left, heard it because it was directed at him. He set down his glass. The sound of it, a small, deliberate sound, was enough to stop his steward from speaking mid-sentence, which was not a thing that happened often. He stood. He did not push his chair back. He stood, which meant the chair went back by the necessary mechanics of a standing person, and the room adjusted. And Lady Cecily looked up, and Mrs. Drummond's expression was still perfectly formed, but had gone very slightly uncertain at the edges. The steward who had been speaking stopped. A footman by the sideboard went very still. He walked to the lower end of the table. End quote. 32 people at a dinner table produce a particular kind of silence when they all stop talking at once. It is not the silence of an empty room. It is the silence of full attention, which is heavier and more precise, and which holds a person in the center of it the way amber holds an insect, completely and without mercy. Several faces turned toward Marian, and she understood in that moment that the calculation was being done in real time, that the room was asking itself who she was and why the Earl of Ashford was walking toward her end of the table. And the answer was arriving in increments that she could not control. She did not look up. She felt the change in the room the way you feel a change in air pressure before rain, not visible yet, but unmistakably there, something shifting in the density of the atmosphere. His footsteps stopped. He stopped beside Marian's chair. He did not touch her. He turned to face the table, and specifically to face the upper half of it. And his voice was the same voice it always was, level and quiet, with the authority of a man who had never once needed volume. And he said, "She wears my father's trust. That is not nothing." 12 words, or near enough. The table was very still. Near the fireplace, an older gentleman, she would later learn he was Lord Ashford's senior neighbor, and had attended 3 generations of vain family dinners, set down his glass without sound. A woman in blue stopped mid-sentence at something she had been saying to her companion. Lady Fanny, at Marian's elbow, took a very slow breath. Mrs. Drummond said, "My lord, the arrangement is concluded," he said. "Kindly convey my respects to Lady Cecily, and inform her the preliminary papers are withdrawn." The silence was different now. It had a texture that the first silence had not had, which was the texture of a room comprehending that the thing it had assumed was fixed had just been picked up and set down somewhere else entirely. Lady Cecily, to her credit, did not flinch. She looked at her plate, and then she looked at her mother. And her expression was the expression of a woman who had expected this less than she had expected to want it. There was something almost relieved in it, which was the most honest thing Marian had seen from her all week. Mrs. Drummond's hand was on her fan. She did not open it. She opened her mouth once and closed it, and the confidence that had organized her face for 40 years was still present, but had shifted from inhabited to performed, which is a shift the observant can detect, and which she would correct by morning. She said once, very quietly, "Nobody at all." And Lord Ashford said nothing, because the argument was over. Only one party had not yet understood it, and he was not a man who pressed past the necessary. He looked down at Marian, who had not moved and whose hands were very still on the tablecloth, and whose face, had the room been watching it rather than watching him, might have told a different story. He said quietly, for her alone, "I apologize for the soup going cold." And she almost laughed. It was only almost. She almost did, and it was the first almost she had permitted herself in 3 months, since the house, since everything, and she did not suppress it as fully as she should have. The winter came in earnest, in the weeks that followed the way winters do when they have been waiting. Steadily, without announcement, the ground going hard and the windows going gray and the trees at Ashford Hall standing in their winter architecture against a sky the color of pewter. Marian was at Ashford Hall because Lord Ashford had asked her through Lady Fanny, and through the proper channels, and with his steward, and a letter to her cousin's husband, to remain as a companion to his daughter through the winter season, in a formal arrangement with proper terms. Until the spring made a longer arrangement possible, and until she had had time to determine what she wanted, which he said in the letter with the care of a man who understood that want was a thing he could not legislate. She had said yes. Clara had taken to appearing at breakfast with a book in her arms, and then sitting with it near Marian, and then handing it to Marian, and the pattern of this was clear to everyone in the household, including Clara, who was 3 years old, and had decided that she liked the way Marian turned pages without rushing, the way she did not speak too loudly. On a Tuesday in January, Lord Ashford came to the morning room while she was reading, and stood in the doorway, which was a thing he had begun to do, and Clara climbed off the sofa and went to him, which was a thing she had recently begun to do, and he took her hand and held it, which was a thing that cost him something, and which he was learning to do anyway. Slowly, the way a man learns to walk again after an injury, with care and without spectacle. He looked at Marian over the child's head. He said, "I have spoken to my solicitor. The matter of the brooch can be made proper if you are willing." She said, "What would proper require?" He said, "Evenly, an exchange of names among other things in the usual order." Clara, who understood that something was being decided and that it was not about her, looked from her father to Marian and then back, with the calculating certainty of a 3-year-old who has already taken stock and made her preferences clear. Marian looked at the brooch in her hand. She had been holding it without noticing, turning it between her fingers the way she had done since the funeral, the small oval warm from her body's heat and the Crest's lines worn smooth at the edges from 31 years on her father's desk. She said, "He told me I carried more worth than any room could measure." Lord Ashford said, "He was right." She closed her hand around it. The fire in the grate was good, and the window showed the snow beginning on the ash trees at the edge of the park, and Clara had returned to the sofa and was leaning against Marian's side with the specific trust of a child who has decided, and Lord Ashford was crossing the room, and the Crest was warm in Marian's palm, and her father had been right. And the word home, which she had not let herself say for 3 months because there was nowhere to put it, was settling somewhere in her chest like a key finding the lock it was cut for. She opened her hand. The brooch caught the firelight. Outside, the snow came down on the park in long, soft curtains, and the ash trees stood in it, and the room was warm, and Marian, who had curtsied too low in a room full of candles and risen from the floor to find that the room had been wrong about her all along, held the brooch in her open palm, and finally, at last, believed it.